Welcome to another episode of the Move Smartly Show. My name is John Pasalis in Toronto, helping buyers and sellers with all of their real estate questions. And today we have our pretty regular monthly segment, which we call the situation, where I go through a number of questions I get from users about their own personal situations. We change some of the details, obviously, so we don't reveal personal information. But I frequently get questions from people asking me what to do in given situations that are quite unique. So we're going to tackle those again today. And of course, we have with us Davin McMahon from Rolosophy. Davin, thank you again for joining me this week.
Yeah, of course. It's great. Like I said, I love these. My favorite ones.
Awesome.
Look
Beautiful.
forward to it.
So I'm going to pass it over to you to kick off kind of our first question for this month.
Sure thing. And first of all, go Blue Jays.
Yes, yes.
Right? Okay. All right. First question. Hi, John. I bought a home in the suburbs about 4 years ago as an investment property. I was renting out individual rooms to international students, and for a while it worked well. The rent covered the costs, and there was steady demand. But over the past year, it's become a lot harder to fill the rooms. With fewer international students coming, I'm often sitting on vacancies, and managing all the turnover with 9 different tenants has become exhausting. On top of that, higher interest rates and lower rents mean I'm now losing about $1,500 a month. My carrying costs are higher than what I'm bringing in. I've thought about selling, but prices in my area have dropped. I'd likely lose over $100,000 if I sold now compared to what I paid. What would you do in my situation? Should I keep holding on or just cut my losses and move on?
Man, what would I do in that situation? I hate to say it, I wouldn't be in that situation. Like, I think one of the challenge, and I feel for people, but listen, I think one of the things that I think people need to understand is that, the best time to get good advice is before you make a particular decision. Because the reality is, with most of these scenarios that we're experiencing today, many of them, while the outcomes weren't predictable, the risks were highly predictable. I just had a client of mine maybe about a month ago email me and said, "Thank you for highlighting the risks when I wanted to buy a pre-construction condo in 2021. You're right, it all played out." And I didn't predict it, but I even wrote an article about this on our blog, which I'll share maybe in a future video, where the risks of buying those were very clear. And very similarly, buying homes to use as rooming houses in the suburbs, those risks were also quite clear. So we couldn't predict the $100,000 price decline, of course. But again, I think one of the challenges with real estate in Canada, in particular in the Toronto area, over the past decade and a half, is a lot of people actually made really, really bad decisions, right? But rising home prices mask those bad decisions, right? If you're buying in a market where prices are going up 6, 7% per year, um, it doesn't matter like if you sell in the short term. And, when I say bad decisions, I mean people who are buying and selling within a year and a half or 2 years because whatever, they made a mistake. Well, yeah, in a normal market, you'd lose a lot of money if you did that. In Toronto, you could buy for a year and a half or 2 years and you probably actually make money. And that's not normal. So this is what I mean where rising prices masked a lot of bad decisions. And now we're in a down market where it's not. So, people, and I've had several questions like the people who are renting units out, it's not making sense. And this person is in a bit of a pickle. There's no right or good outcome because, right? Like if you hold on to it, you're bleeding $1,500 a month. The reality is, if your goal is to try to recover, at least break even in terms of what you bought it for, what you sold it for, so on and so forth, um, how long are you going to wait? Because again, I can't predict the future. Most people I know are not expecting a massive rebound in home prices anytime soon. And in fact, the concern is things are going to be sluggish economically, which might flow through to even softer prices next year. So you're holding on to this property. You're losing close to 20 grand a year, not losing, but out of pocket. And yes, some of that goes towards your principal, but for the most part, you're kind of forking cash out of pocket to float this thing. Um, and how much are you going to be spending out of pocket over the next 3, 4, 5, 6 years for prices to recover is one consideration. The other consideration is to actually sell it in today's market. um, we've talked about this in our meetings. Like, you have to, unfortunately, vacate, like, make it vacant. Like, everyone has to leave. No one wants to buy a tenanted property today. Like, nobody. Absolutely. You don't even waste your time listing it. So all of your 9 tenants or 7 tenants, however many you have to leave. You have to clean the home, prep it, make it, try to stand out, relative to the other homes. And at the end of the day, what you think is $100,000 discount might end up being 150. And then what do you do when you're getting even less money and you're sitting on a vacant unit and you're not 1,500 cash flow negative, you're 4 or 5,000 per month because you have a vacant property now? What do you do? So there's no great outcome. Like, for people who can't afford it, you're probably just trying to find a way to hold on to it, because when it goes vacant, you're going to be vacant for quite a while. It's not like your home's going to sell in 2 weeks. You could be vacant for months and months. And can you afford that? I don't know. Davin, what do you think? Did I kind of miss anything?
No, no. I mean, just to kind of get more into it, you have to do not just clean up the property. You've got to remove every piece of evidence that this place was in fact a rooming house.
Hmm.
The stigma of it being a rooming house versus maybe a more traditional rental or just an end user single family home. That's not going to leave a great taste in the mouth of buyers. They'll
Yeah,
want that house either not at all or at a steep discount. So all the things like a lock on every bedroom door, and
it's, you're right.
that. There are markers that your spidey senses tingle, and you're going to have to remove those. And depending on how it's been treated with 9 tenants with all this turnover, you might have to put up some capital to do small renovations, some cosmetic items, because like you said, it's got to stand out to some degree. And I'm going to assume this is like a suburban home, so these homes aren't as attractive for people who want to come in and do you know big renovations, right? That's usually reserved for older homes, right? Because I'm assuming this is probably something built in the last 20 years. So it's going to be tough, and depending where this is, and I have a few ideas of where this is. That's a pretty saturated market for single family homes that either were again end user tenanted or rooming houses, and you just have to stand out and sell well amongst all that. You've got to be obviously a perfect product or really aggressively priced, which in both instances is either going to cost you money to do or going to cost you money when you sell.
Yeah, exactly.
So
And
what should I do? Should I keep holding on or cut my losses and move on? I mean, investing in this was a good idea until it wasn't. Investing in Nortel was a good idea until it wasn't. So I don't know. Like, it feels like I cut my loss now because the projection in the future is how long until you can actually recover this, theoretical $100,000.
But here's the thing, again, the challenge, going back to saying cutting your losses might be uh makes sense for a lot of people, but financially they can't. To your point, you have to you're right, and I agree 100% with you. You have to invest capital to clean it up, because you're 100% correct. When you show homes and there's locks on every bedroom door, and like these signs of a rooming house, people don't like that. The average family that wants to buy it kind of doesn't like the idea that this used to be a rooming house. They're worried, what if there's something wrong with it? And there may or may not be, but the point is it does have a bit of a stigma. So you have to invest a little bit of money. You got to paint the home, you got to clean it, and you've got to sit with it vacant for 3, 4, 5, 6 months. And does this person have, and that's an extra expense. That's going to be another 30, 40,000 out of pocket over and above the $100,000 loss, which might end up being 150 if they actually end up needing to sell pretty quickly. So yeah, there's no perfect outcome. Like if you are selling, you just have to have a good plan to be able to float that. And again, like the best time to get advice, and it seems, easy to say now, but it's the truth. It's before you buy because you want to thinking about mitigating all of these risks. If I'm buying an investment property, I'm buying knowing that my horizon is forever, quite frankly. Like I don't care what happens in the market. Even if my vacancies hit high, I can float it. Like you don't want to be in the position where you're stressed financially and you need to sell, right? And I think this is how you make sound investment decisions to never feel vulnerable like this, where my only decisions are losing 150,000 or forking out $1,500 out of my own pocket. Like no one should ever be in that position when they're investing in real estate. And yeah, you can avoid that. I mean, I've been doing this my whole life. I've never been in this situation. But again, doing that is more prudent. Doing that is, not falling into this. You have to buy. I'm going to make tons of money. It's just going to go up 100 grand next year. You don't have that mindset, right? And I think that's part of the challenge when people were buying in the boom. This is what most people wanted to hear. Just buy the this is why agents were talking, and agents were selling what the consumer wanted to hear, that these are get rich quick schemes, right? And if you're investing, you don't want to be caught up into the how am I going to make a ton of money? You want to be in the mindset of it's a long-term asset that you're holding and you're using as a long-term rental.
Yeah, and I do feel for this person. I mean, because it's while it was risky, yes, it was a policy decision that ultimately was the undoing with the international students. So I mean, the colleges that are struggling with you know students coming in, be that international or otherwise. Yeah, that's going to hit those who have rooming houses. Not that colleges should be relying on the public to house their students entirely,
Mhm.
unless that's the situation that we're.
Yeah, I mean, it's that policy decision, but also, the fact that we were in a bit of a bubble, as soon as the Bank of Canada raised rates, prices fell like 27%.
Yeah,
So there's a
that's the other
ton
part
of
of it. Yeah,
anyhow. So I hope we did our best to answer. There's no great answers, I guess, is the point. I mean, I think everyone has to do what they can afford to do financially. And, you want to decide if you're getting stretched to the point where you're falling behind on your mortgage payments, you want to make quick decisions and figure out what you're doing. And if you can carry it, you want to work with your lender, is the last thing that I'll say. If you feel like the financial strain is too much, that you might start falling behind, you want to talk to your bank. You want to think about what options they have, extending your amortizations, lowering your payment, doing whatever they can to help you hang on. Pretending there isn't a problem is the worst thing you can do. Most lenders want to work with households, with investors, the people who have the properties. They don't want to take them over. So you want to be very proactive if you're feeling financial strain and might feel like you're in a position where you have to default on your mortgage, and it's a power sale. You ideally don't want to go down that road. You want to be proactive with your lenders and figure out something that can work, hopefully.
yeah, very true. All right, let's go to the next question.
All right.
Hi, John. I'm a landlord in Ontario thinking about selling a tenanted property. Here we go again.
All
I
right.
read your February 2024 article about the N12 and N11 processes, and it
Mhm.
really helped make sense of what can be a confusing situation. But I had one question you didn't cover.
Okay, okay. Let's
When-
hit, let's hit pause let's hit pause before you finish because I think this is already confusing to most people. So before we kind of go over the question, let me just quickly touch on the two things that I think are not intuitive to everybody. When you sell a tenanted property in Ontario, if you're a landlord, number one, you can't kick out your tenant to sell your property, and a lot of people don't realize this. So there's two kind of ways to sell a tenanted property. Assuming the tenant is on a month-to-month lease, they're not during their first year of their term, you can sell it with the tenant living there, and the purchaser can make an offer that includes a clause says that the landlord will give the tenant notice that the tenant must vacate for the purchaser's own use. It's called an N12 form. It's a notice to end the tenancy for the purchaser's own use. That is one way to terminate a tenancy. Many buyers don't like that because, before COVID, 99% of tenants would just vacate on closing. They would just move out if they got the notice. But since COVID, a lot of tenants have been refusing to vacate. And the buyer's concern is, well, what if I buy this home? We give the tenant notice, and the tenant says, I'm not moving out. And they can sit there for a year. It can take up to a year to evict a tenant who's not paying rent. So not only have you bought this property that you intend your family to move in, not only is the tenant not moved out, now potentially they're not even paying rent, and you have this problem to deal with as a purchaser. So it's a massive risk for buyers. Most buyers don't love it. So the other approach to uh, selling and buying a tenanted property is for the owner to negotiate something called an 11, which is a mutual agreement to end the tenancy. In this situation, you're not giving notice, because if you give notice with the N12, the tenant can dispute it, go to the landlord tenant board, and drag out the process. With an N11, they've agreed to vacate. And if they for whatever reason refuse to leave, the eviction process is a lot faster because they've already signed and agreed to vacate the unit. So that is just a quick overview of the different approaches. People have been leaning on and trying to negotiate N11s now because it makes buyers feel more confident that the tenant's actually going to move out. So that's the quick overview.
Okay, perfect. So you had one question you didn't cover, apparently. You mentioned that when a sale is conditional on the buyer moving in, the N11, the agreement to end the tenancy, is usually signed only after the buyer asks for it. The problem, of course, is that if the tenant refuses to sign, the deal can fall apart. Wouldn't it make more sense to have the tenant sign an N11 before listing the property with a clause that says something like this? The tenant agrees to end the tenancy and vacate with 2 full calendar months of an unconditional sale to a buyer who intends to occupy the home for at least 12 months. That way, the seller has more certainty that the tenant will leave and can show buyers the signed N11 up front, while the tenant still has protection, since it only takes effect if the sale is genuinely for the buyer's own use. What do you think of that approach? Steve.
Okay, so I'm gonna have to unpack this a little bit because I feel like it's a lot of insider baseball, and I think refers to a post that I wrote. So there's a couple of ways as a landlord you can negotiate an N11 with a tenant. So number one is you just say to your tenant, listen, I'm selling the unit. Ideally, I'd like you to move out. Let's sign an 11. And typically the landlord compensates the tenant. It's what's called in the industry cash for keys. So the tenant gets cash, the landlord gets the keys, basically. And how much the tenant gets compensated varies. There's no set number. It could be 2 months, could be 3 months rent, whatever it is. And again, both parties have to agree. You can't force the tenant to do this. The tenant can say, I don't want to do cash for keys. I don't want to terminate. Or they could be irrational and say, I want 12 months rent, which the landlord is obviously never going to do. So you can negotiate that up front. The positive thing is it is agreement that is signed. There is a timeline for when the tenant's going to move out. Potentially, as a landlord, you can wait for them to move out and then list it vacant, clean it up, prep it, all of that stuff. So that's one way to do it. The other way to do it is, I think, what this person's referring to, which I discussed in my article, which was, and again, these are situational. Like it's a function of what the tenant's needs are, what the landlord's needs are, and we find a middle ground. And I think the situation I described in that article at that time, we had a tenant that wasn't in a rush to move out, preferred to stay. And we also had a landlord that didn't want the tenants to vacate. He didn't want the property to be, and the property had two tenants. He didn't want it to be vacant for 2 months. He didn't want to have no cash flow for 2 months. So, if the property took a little longer to sell, he didn't want to be in that position. So, what we decided was to negotiate in advance the terms of the N11 to say, listen, if we get someone who wants to buy the property and they want to move in, you agree to sign the N11 and we'll give you whatever it is, 3 months rent, a letter of reference, all of this good stuff. And typically the way this happens in practice is you would have this signed, what is effectively an agreement to sign an N11 with the basic terms, just to say we're all on the same page. And then when we're selling the property, the purchaser would say, okay, seller, you have 1 week to finalize the N11, right? And then typically this would actually be the last clause in the agreement because, again, my seller client doesn't want to kick out the tenants if this guy's still doing his home inspection, hasn't sorted out his inspection and financing, right? So in practice, the way this worked was that the purchaser did their inspection, they got their financing done. Once all their conditions were waived, well, then we had 1 week to finalize the N11. And it was very seamless because we had already negotiated and agreed on the terms. And again, I think this is what a lot of people don't understand when you're selling tenant properties, when we represent the landlord. You have to think about and plan these things. You're not flying by the seat of your freaking pants. You can't negotiate these things in a week. Like it took us some time. We negotiated the terms of the N11 with the tenant before we even hit the market. We want clarity. We want certainty. So once the purchaser had waived all their conditions, we had 1 week to sign the N11. We knew how much notice the tenant wanted, and I think in our case it was 90 days rather than 60 days. So everyone knew. So we got it signed, and the deal was finalized. Because, and again, going back to what I said, this may not be perfect for everybody, but this is address the needs of the tenant and the landlord. Now, going back to the question that this person had raised, can't you, and I think it was something like, can't you just sign the N11 with the tenant that basically says they'll vacate with 2 months' notice upon the unconditional sale to a buyer who intends to occupy the home for at least 12 months? Okay. And there's all sorts of problems with trying to draft it that way, even though the landlord might like it that way. Number one, I don't even know if that's enforceable. Number one, it's like it's an agreement to end the tenancy with no end date, with no clarity on if the tenant's even going to have to move out, right? So, this would be some basic, like this would consist of like this type of clause is effectively like what we would have signed with the tenant before signing the N11, the basic terms of the N11, right? But you cannot sign an N11 that says you're going to move out 2 months after I unconditionally sell my property. What the heck does that mean? Like that could be 2 months from now, it could be 9 months from now, it could be never, right? So it's a very vague clause. So you wouldn't want to put that in an 11. I don't even know if it's enforceable. Requiring it so that the purchaser moves in, like it just has so many red flags and risks for the landlord and for the purchaser. I would never structure it that way. So again, I mean, I gave earlier 2 examples of how to structure. That's just 2 examples. You always want to be thinking about what works for both parties. And, in some cases, I think in one of the videos I had, like the tenant was stubborn. They want like 9 months rent or something like that. So we just worked around them. And it's kind of unfortunate because we offered them a very reasonable deal. In the end, in this other scenario, I had the purchaser actually was fine with taking on the risk. And then we were just going to, whatever we were willing to give the tenant, we compensated the purchaser, right? And the tenant in the end ended up moving out and they just got 1 month's compensation because, listen, to squat and to not move out, obviously affects the profile of the tenant if they're trying to rent another property. A lot of people threaten to do that. Not everybody does because it makes it a lot harder for them to rent somewhere else. So you have to deal with the situation you have. Sometimes you're negotiating with the tenant, sometimes you're not if they're not working with you and you're working with the other party. And I mean, to be honest with you, these are the things that I love the most about real, like these complicated situations where you have multiple parties and this is the fun thing about negotiating. It's really navigating everyone's concerns, figuring out where there's space and figuring out what the best outcome is. It's not always cookie cutter.
Yep. Getting to Yes by
Yes.
some Harvard author. I don't remember.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yuri, I forget his last name. I forget his name. Yeah.
But is there? I mean, you mentioned a few things to do before, and like an agreement to sign an 11. Is there any way to set it up where Steve's thing would work, where you can have an 11,
Yeah.
11 signed before a listing?
Yeah, you can. I think, and that's the situation I talk about first, which is basically you just sign the N11 and it has a clear end date, right? And that end date could be 4 months from now, it could be 2 months from now, it could be whatever, and a pre-negotiated compensation for the tenant, whether it's 2 months or 3 months or whatever it is. So certainly you can sign the N11 before you list the market. And as a landlord, if your tenant's unit looks great and it's not messy, you can actually list it while the tenant's still living there and saying, we have an N11, the tenant's vacating on this date. So that's another approach to do it. So you definitely can sign the N11. I think my point was I wouldn't sign it the way this reader sent in with these vague end dates, because you may not even have an executed 11. If you never sell the property, then the tenant's never moving out, right? So it's also, it's just not a great way to structure it. So you either want to sign an L11 and the tenant is for sure moving out, or you want to have some predetermined kind of conditions under which you would sign an 11 if needed. And again, going back to my original story, we didn't pre-sign the N11 because the tenant wanted to stay. And we, as the landlord and the seller, were trying to sell the property to an investor. We didn't want to necessarily kick out the tenant. So we wanted to try to meet the tenant's needs and the landlord's needs. And that's one of the reasons why we did it that way. So we had these basic terms that said, yes, okay, fine. If the tenant has to move out, this way you're going to get compensated. But let's try to find a buyer who wants to keep the tenants, right? So again, it's kind of you're trying to understand both parties' goals.
Yeah, and whenever we have a new tenant turnover, someone vacates on their own, free will, which of course happens. That's the time to kind of reevaluate, the investment you have, the condo. Because I've had numerous clients who say to me, "We're vacant now. What should we do? Should we try and sell now? I want to rent it out again, collect the rents, but I want to maybe sell in 8 months, 9 months, whatever it might be." And these are the kind of things you have to think about because, yeah, selling a tenanted property comes with, it's hurdles, and this being one of them. How to get a tenant to move out should an end user want to actually use the place, and with policies that were coming in place with the new bill. What was the bill number with the tenant protections? They're going to be moving some things around.
Yeah, I think it was Bill 60.
Bill 60. Okay, I think that's not really going to be taking place, but. How does one protect themselves against, a tenant, who wants to be a squatter? I asked the theoretical question a long time ago. Can you just have an N11 signed at the onset of a tenancy to say, I'm leaving after a year, sign it? Like you can't.
Not really, no. You can't. Yeah, that would be like a fixed term tenant. You can't really do it then. Because that's just like pre-deciding that the tenant is going to get kicked out after 12 months. It's not really allowed. So these are typically negotiated after the fact.
Yeah.
So okay, hopefully that answered our readers, our viewers' question.
Let's see if it's a tenant related or not. Okay. Hi, John. I really enjoy these segments. I like how you explain things in such an approachable way. I have a question about buying condos. I'm searching with a family member, and we've been booking showings directly with the listing agents for each property. What we've noticed is that every agent seems to handle things very differently. Some are helpful and follow up, others barely engage with us. I've heard that it can sometimes be an advantage to deal directly with the listing agent, but given how inconsistent the experience has been, is this actually a good idea? Thanks, Kay.
Oh man. I don't even know where to start with this question. I mean, the assumption that it's an advantage to work with a listing agent, I suspect is a little misguided. If you're buying a condo, the listing agent's not telling you that there's another building going up that's going to block your view. The listing agent's not telling you that someone sold at a massive discount 2 weeks ago in the building and the comparables, this is overpriced. Like the listing agent technically can't tell you those things. So this idea that there's this massive benefit in working with the listing agent, I feel is a little misguided. As everyone sees in the show, there are actually risks to buying real estate. Real estate doesn't always go up. There are downsides, and there are ways to mitigate risk. And the listing agent's job isn't to help you mitigate risk. Now, having said that, just because you hire your own agent, it doesn't mean they're going to help you mitigate the risk either. I mean, It's really interesting because we don't really see how a lot of agents work. But I mean, I have these clients who have been like long-standing clients of mine. I don't know, like 15 years, but they relocated. They're moving out of the city. We just sold their home, and they're looking for properties like in Hamilton and Brantford and, Kitchener-Waterloo, like kind of those areas, and they keep reaching out to agents, and their experience is the same. Like everyone's freaking terrible. Everyone's either pushy, or they don't give you info, or they don't respond to your inquiries for 5 days. Which I just find, I mean, so they just keep emailing me questions. I mean, even though I don't really work in those areas, I can do some research, I mean, just to help them. But the bar is very low in real estate. A lot of agents aren't great. And I think, as whether you're buying or selling, I think it's really up to you to do your own due diligence, to really interview agents, to ask them difficult questions, ask them some of the questions I've had on our show, and see how they respond. Like the bar that you should be setting for the person that you're working with should be high. Um, so I don't know. I think that's the better approach, to interview multiple people, and then decide who to work with, rather than, hoping you're going to get someone decent by going to a listing agent or getting some deal. Because to be honest with you, I mean, and Davin, you tell me, like all the times we look at a, a lot of the times we look at properties where you're like, oh my God, who paid this price for the home? A lot of the times it's a property where the listing agent double ended it and represented both parties, um, because the buyer's a little bit in the dark, honestly, and you think it's straightforward to figure out what a property's worth. It's really not. It's so nuanced. Um, but anyhow, that's my 2 cents. I don't know what your thoughts are.
Well, yeah, there's the incentives are just different for a listing agent with a buyer coming to them, right? The obviously their incentive is to sell the property and be beholden to the seller, but even then, some agents are just they're incentivized for just themselves,
Hmm.
right? So I think for the buyers out there, you definitely need, yeah, like you said, do your own due diligence, find out who's actually acting in your best interest. And you can suss them out pretty easily by, like I said, asking the difficult questions. And in fact, meeting them with them beforehand. Instead of just meeting them at the condo, you take the tour and then, away you go. And furthermore, they're having some changes to how parties can or cannot be represented in real estate. Previously we had like customer service agreements, which I mean might get in the weeds, but like there's client representation and customer service. Those were different, but the agent was still beholden to the buyer for some responsibility. Now they have what's called a self-represented party, what it's called,
Yeah.
and that just it takes a little more of the responsibility, accountability, I think, to some degree, off the listing agent to that buyer. So they're really, really on their own. So a listing agent could put that agreement in front of them and say, kind of, you're on your own, and sell the property in that manner. Where I think as real estate professionals, we should be accountable to both parties, even though we are, our first priority would be the seller in this instance. I think just ethically, we should be acting to some degree for both sides.
Well, I don't
Um,
know. I don't know if we
I
should.
mean,
If you're,
ethically. So I think if you can't separate yourself like that, I know that there are some brokerages and agents who won't double end.
but the double ending, okay, I think there's a couple of things to unpack for people. The double ending just refers to one agent making both ends of the commission, which is one thing. But when it comes to representation, you know, if I'm listing a property and a buyer comes to purchase it, uh, I never represent the buyer, because I feel like, again, I think that that's the challenge. And a lot of agents do this. And quite frankly, most lawsuits, like between consumers and agents, has to do when the agent is trying to straddle both sides and represent two parties, which means they're trying to get the seller the highest price and the buyer the lowest price, and get the buyer the best terms and the seller the best terms, which doesn't really work so well. So you have to be mindful of that. Even if the agent says they're representing you, it's a bit of a conflict of interest. So typically, when we'll do it, if we have a situation like that, we'll generally not represent the purchaser. They have to know they have to do some of their own due diligence. In some cases, they're fine with it, they're very experienced, but again, I think you just have to be a very knowledgeable buyer if you want to do that. You have to kind of know the risks. I generally think it's better for have someone to actually represent you so they take on part of that burden to mitigate that risk for you. Awesome. Hopefully that was helpful. Did we have any others before we wrap up?
We do have one that I think could be pretty quick. John, if multiple units have been merged into one large unit, do the voting shares assigned to the now large single unit remain the same, or does that owner now have one vote as opposed to several votes? So I imagine we're talking about a condo.
Mhm.
Within our building, someone has made 3 units into one, removing interior walls, rerouting HVAC, electrical, etc. Does that unit still get 3 votes or one? Thank you for your time and consideration, Susan.
That's actually a very unique question. I cannot imagine there are many situations where three condos are merged into one unit. Um, Again, I don't have this condo corps, declaration and bylaws, but my instinct would be this, that if this has legally been separated into from 3 units into one, meaning on the land registry, there is one unique identifier for these units, which is the combination of all three, rather than three unique identifiers. Yeah, they would get one vote, not three. Your votes in most condo corporations is not a function of how big you are, it's by unit. So if they have been legally merged or assembled into one, my instinct is that person, and that would be reflected in the condominium documents, of course, because they wouldn't be getting three different maintenance bills, they'd be getting one maintenance bill. Then yeah, my instinct is it would be probably just one vote at that point,
Yeah.
assuming that was done.
The 400 square foot studio has the same voting rights as the 1,500 square foot three bed condo.
Exactly. That's exactly the idea. Beautiful. Well, thank you all for your questions this month. We really appreciate them. Hopefully, you got something out of them. As always, if you have your own questions, feel free to send them over at askjohn@movesmartly.com, and we'll do our best to answer them at next month's episode. Until next time.